Hi, I'm Jenny Miller of Let's Get Sewing. Are you ready to take the fear and frustration out of your sewing experience and finally get sewing? Then you're in the right place. Be sure to click subscribe so you don't miss any of my tips and tutorials. And check out the caption too. There's a link to my website where you can find out more about my course, Conquer Your Sewing Machine, and future courses that I have coming. And now, let's get sewing. Today, we're going to be talking about a topic that we don't often like to mention as sewists, and that is when we have to rip out a seam. But I want to kind of reframe your thought process around this before we even start talking about your options when you need to remove a seam. Sometimes when we are creating, we put an awful lot of pressure on ourselves to be perfect the first time or even every time, and that is not possible. Yes, as you practice things, you get used to them more, you do start to improve and get better and hopefully make fewer mistakes. But even the most seasoned sewist will tell you that they make mistakes all the time. Sometimes just from sheer getting into the rhythm of things and kind of forgetting what you're doing. That happens to me all the time. Even though I know what I'm doing, my mind starts to wander because I'm in the groove and then suddenly realize I've made a mistake. One mistake I just made recently, as in the day before yesterday, I was putting the collar on this Ilford jacket, and I made the mistake of assuming how the collar was going to go together because I've done so many collars. I thought I knew what I was doing. What I failed to do was read the directions ahead of time. So there's a little hint for you. Read through the instructions before you start. I assembled the collar just like I do with all the other collars that I make, but this particular pattern has a little twist on that. And so when it came time to attach the collar to the jacket, my collar was upside down. So I had to completely remove the collar and take part of it apart, make a few adjustments before I could put it back on. I got it done. Everything worked out fine, but I decided that I needed to take the opportunity to use my learning experience to help you so that you can avoid doing the same thing. So part of our video today, you're actually going to see me removing the collar from this jacket and how I did that very quickly and easily. So what I try to tell myself when I do make mistakes is that they're part of the process. So I need to take a breath and keep moving as slowly as I was when I was sewing. Sometimes we feel like we have to hurry up and fix it because it's a problem. And I'm trying to reframe my brain around that, or my thought process around that, that it's just part of the process. And so now we're going to slow down and pick things apart. Now, everyone probably knows what this little tool here is. You've probably seen a seam ripper before. Some people even name their seam rippers. I don't have a name for mine. You're going to find out from this video that I don't use mine all that often or all that extensively. Seam rippers are really good for getting in under one little stitch at a time. And so when I need that, and you'll see, I'll use it for one or two stitches, but I like to use several other methods. Probably my main method is to use a utility razor, just like you would buy. In fact, I do buy them in a large package at a hardware store, or sewing supply stores have them. It is a razor blade with a blade on one side, and it's protected on this side so you can hold it very easily. That's what you will see demonstrated when I show how I took the collar off. I used this razor blade. There are also a couple of different techniques you can do with this seam ripper, and I'm going to show you both of those. And then we're going to talk about this one. These are hair clippers, actually, that I have used for sewing. I'll talk to you a little bit more about when specifically I use these, but they are kind of handy to have on hand on occasion for getting out a seam really quickly. So let's start talking about the different tools and how to use them most effectively and most efficiently so that you can fix your mistakes and get back to sewing. All right, let's talk about the traditional seam ripper first. Most people that I watch when they use their seam ripper take it and do one stitch at a time. And it is made and designed very well for getting underneath the stitches like that and taking out one stitch at a time. But there are a lot of stitches across here, and that is going to take a very long time, one stitch at a time, right? What you can do with your seam ripper is turn it over so the ball is down and the point is up. You'll want to use it to get your first couple of stitches open. You can even open it like this and get a stitch out that way so that you have it opened, I don't know, what is that, a half inch, 5/8 of an inch. So with my ball down and my point on the top, you can then take your seam ripper and just kind of pull it through like that. And it's going to take both hands, but it's definitely faster than one seam at a time, and it will go through. You just want to be careful. You see how the fabric is bunching? If this was a really lightweight fabric or a loosely woven fabric, it might be apt to cut into the fabric, but that works fairly well pulling it. Also, once you get it going, if you can hold it from behind like this, you should be able to get your seam ripper in there and push it on through. Now, when you get to where you've back stitched, things always get tighter. You may have to stop and do those 1 or 2 stitches at a time. But that is how you would use a traditional seam ripper most effectively. Now I'm going to talk to you about when I use a razor blade for taking out seams. I actually keep a razor blade like this sitting on top of my sewing machine all the time so I can grab it and use it. And I buy my razor blades in a package of 100 like this. Get them at the local hardware store, fairly cheap and very versatile. Okay, I don't want to call it a happy accident this week, but I did make a mistake this week. I assumed something about this pattern and made my collar backwards. So now it has to come off and be turned around. So I decided that for this, I could demo how I use a razor blade for taking out seams. So this line here is the stay stitching. We're going to ignore it. This is our seam here, and it comes all the way to this corner right here. And so in order to get it started, I first have to put on my granny glasses so that I can see the stitches and get 1 or 2 of them unpicked. It'll just make it easier once I get started. So I'm going to use my seam ripper and just get that going. So now my seam is open. I'm going to take my razor blade and just kind of cut. And a lot of people think, oh my gosh, how do you do that? You can kind of feel with the razor blade what you are hitting. So I know as I'm pulling these apart that the stitches are the hardest or most solid part. And so I just kind of feel for that and start cutting. It also feels a little different if you accidentally start to cut into the fabric, but it's really so easy. You're rarely going to do that unless your stitches are really tiny or the fabric, sometimes really flimsy fabric is a little bit harder, but I've used this technique on some very fine fabrics as well. I've hit a spot here where I had backstitch because I had to stop and then start again, and so I had to backstitch in the middle of the seam, but there we go, we got over that. Now we're to the other end here, and I can just tell that because of how hard it is. But now, once I get past that, I can just keep going. And we are just about to the end. This is where I backstitched again, so I can tell it's a little bit heavier stitching, and the collar is off. I also want to show you, if you're taking out a seam like this where it is top stitched, how you can use a razor blade. Now, These are jeans. They're fairly durable, so it's easy to get that razor blade down in there and just kind of work it until you know you're cutting the seams. And once you've got them cut, see how the razor blade goes all the way in there now? I can actually very carefully come around the hem of the jeans fairly quickly. I'm holding it between my fingers and thumbs like this because keeping it nice and straight allows the blade to slide really easily between the fabric and only get the seam. When I get to a seam intersection like that, it's a little bit tougher. I'm just going to get that going, and then I can go right back to sliding it through the seam. And that is how you would take out the seam. Besides the razor, this is probably the technique I use the most. This is going to look a little bit brutal on your fabric, but your thread is almost always less strong. Your fabric's almost always stronger than your thread. And so the fabric's not going to tear. I have even done this on delicate formal fabrics like bridesmaids dresses and things like that. So it works really well, really fast, and a great way to get your aggression out if you're really upset about the mistake that you've made. As always, I take my seam ripper and get those first few stitches unpicked. And just get that opened up. And I'm going to need a loose thread that I can grab for this. So I'm going to take this side. It looks a little bit better. And see, I have this nice long thread that I can grab. I'm going to wrap that between my fingers to get a good hold on it. And I am going to pull it against the seam, so towards my stitching. So I am going to pull that. And can you see how much popped out just in that one pull? Now I flip it over, and it's handy to have my seam ripper to grab. I'm going to continue to pull this towards the stitching. And you can see my fabric is absolutely fine. The thread snaps before the fabric ever breaks. And this one actually sometimes will pull out your back stitching at the end. So I love that one because it's fast and easy and works every time. Finally, I want to talk to you about this uh, electric razor. Now, I do not recommend using this on lightweight fabrics. I probably would not even typically use it with a quilter's cotton like this. However, my sample is quilter's cotton. But I would use this on something like jeans or canvas, something thick. The reason for that is, these little teeth, if the fabric can get down between those teeth easily, it can get cut. And I have done that and cut a little hole in my fabric. But if the fabric is thick like a denim or a canvas, it's not going to get down in there. And so for that, this can be very effective. Just like our other techniques, I use my seam ripper. Like I said, I use this seam ripper often, just not extensively, because I always use it to get the first couple of stitches going, like I said, and to get that seam open. Now you're going to take the razor, and I turn it down this direction so that I'm pointing down into the seam, and turn it on. And then you just get in there and cut those threads using it. And if you really want, you can put it down on the table like this and just get in there and try to just get the stitches like that. Now I've come to the end where I back stitched. I always, rather than risk ripping my fabric with any of these methods, I always stop and pick that out with my seam ripper. I hope you found this helpful. Like I said, mistakes are always part of the process, but being able to fix them efficiently and quickly will help take the stress out of that process for sure. And now, let's get sewing. Thank you for joining me today. My goal is to take the frustration out of your sewing experience, and so I hope my tips are helpful. Feel free to comment with any questions or ideas you may have. I will try to get back to you as soon as I can. Now, let's get sewing.